The room didn't fall silent when the lawyer walked in. It fell silent when my son started laughing. Not a nervous laugh, not an awkward one, the kind of laugh a man makes when he's already counted money that isn't his. He leaned back in his chair, loosened his expensive tie, and looked around the conference room. "I told you," he said with a grin. "Dad never could say no to family." A few relatives chuckled. One of my cousins shook his head. "Looks like Richard's finally getting the company." No one noticed the attorney wasn't smiling. She simply placed a thick black folder on the table and looked at every face in the room. "Is everyone here?" Richard answered before anyone else could. "Everyone who matters." Those 5 words should have hurt. Instead, they made me smile because Richard had no idea this room wasn't about to reward him. It was about to expose him. 3 days earlier, I had died peacefully in my sleep. 78 years old. After building Harper Steel from a one-room workshop into one of Pennsylvania's most respected family businesses. The newspapers called me a successful businessman. The employees called me boss. But the only title I'd ever cared about was Dad. Somewhere along the way, my son forgot what that word meant. It hadn't always been that way. When Richard was 8, he followed me everywhere. He'd wear an oversized hard hat and pretend he was running the factory. "One day this will all be mine," he'd say. I'd laugh. "No, it'll be yours to protect." There was a difference. I just didn't realize he never understood it. After my wife Eleanor passed away 4 years ago, Richard changed. Or maybe he simply stopped pretending. His phone calls became shorter. His visits became rarer. Every conversation somehow ended with money. "Dad, the company should be in younger hands." "Dad, you don't need this big house anymore." "Dad, you've worked long enough." At first, it sounded like concern. Later, it sounded like calculation. The moment that changed everything happened 8 months before my funeral. I had collapsed inside the factory. Nothing serious, just exhaustion. The doctors kept me overnight. Richard arrived before sunrise. Not with flowers, not with breakfast, with legal papers. "I've already spoken to an attorney," he said. "You should sign these while you're thinking clearly." I looked at the documents. Power of attorney, control of my bank accounts, control of Harper Steel, control of everything. I pushed them back across the hospital bed. "I'm still alive." His smile disappeared. "I was only trying to help." "No, you were trying to hurry." He walked out without saying goodbye. That afternoon, someone else walked into my hospital room, my 14-year-old grandson. Ethan still wearing his school backpack. He looked terrified, not because I was in the hospital, because he thought he might lose his grandfather. He sat beside my bed for almost an hour. Neither of us spoke much. Before leaving, he reached into his backpack and handed me something, a folded piece of paper. I made this in history class. It was a family tree. At the very top, he had written one sentence in blue marker. "A family isn't measured by what it inherits, but by what it protects." I stared at those words long after he left. A 14-year-old boy understood legacy better than most adults in my family. That's when I made my decision. Not out of anger, out of clarity. The following week, I called my attorney, Margaret Collins. "I need to rewrite my will." She looked surprised. "You've had the same will for almost 20 years. "I know. Something changed." She studied my face for several seconds. "This isn't really about money, is it?" I slowly shook my head. "No. It's about character." She closed her notebook. "Then tell me everything." For nearly 3 hours, I told her about the hospital. The legal papers, the constant pressure, the quiet disrespect, and one conversation Richard didn't know I'd overheard. 2 months earlier, I had stopped by his house to surprise Ethan on his birthday. As I reached the front porch, I heard Richard speaking through the open kitchen window. "Dad won't last much longer." His wife laughed softly. "So what's the plan?" Richard answered without hesitation. "The old man's worth a fortune. We just have to be patient." I never knocked. I quietly left the birthday gift by the door and drove home alone. Margaret listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked only one question. "What do you want your will to accomplish?" I looked at the framed photograph of Eleanor sitting beside her desk. "I want the truth to walk into the room." She nodded, then opened a brand new file. For the next 6 weeks, we changed everything. Every signature, every clause, every instruction. When we finished, Margaret placed the documents into 2 separate envelopes. One was handed to the probate court. The other, she locked inside her office safe. "No one sees this. No one. Not even Richard. Especially not Richard." She smiled sadly. "I have a feeling." Your family is about to learn the difference between inheritance and legacy. Now, the room waited. Richard crossed his arms. Can we stop wasting time? Margaret ignored him. She broke the official seal. Read the first page, then suddenly stopped. Her eyes lifted toward the conference room door. A slow smile crossed her face. Perfect timing. Everyone turned. The door opened. 14-year-old Ethan stepped inside, breathing hard, still wearing his school clothes. I'm sorry I'm late. My teacher wouldn't let me leave until... Margaret gently interrupted him. You made it. Richard frowned. Dad's will has nothing to do with the child. Margaret looked directly into his eyes. Actually, it has everything to do with him. Then she reached beneath the table and pulled out a second envelope. Across the front, written in my own handwriting, were the words no one in that room was prepared to read. Nothing begins until my grandson is seated. Ethan quietly took the empty chair beside my attorney. He looked around the room, confused, nervous. He had no idea why he had been called. Richard let out another laugh. This is ridiculous. He's 14. What could he possibly have to do with Dad's estate? Margaret didn't answer. She simply placed the second envelope beside the will. Then she looked directly at Ethan. Your grandfather gave me one instruction: if you weren't in this room, I was forbidden from reading another word. The smiles around the table slowly disappeared. Richard leaned forward. Fine, he's here. Can we finally get this over with? Margaret nodded. She opened the will. The last will and testament of Daniel Harper. She paused. As requested by Mr. Harper. I will read every word exactly as written. Richard crossed his arms confidently. Please do, Margaret began. To my family, if you're hearing these words, then my time on this earth has ended. I hope you remember me for the man I tried to be, not just for the things I owned. The room remained quiet. Even Richard stopped smiling. Margaret continued reading. I built Harper Steel with my wife, not to create wealthy children, but to create honest ones. One of my nephews shifted uncomfortably. Richard whispered, Get to the important part. Margaret ignored him. Money reveals character. It never creates it. Richard rolled his eyes. Oh, come on. We don't need another lecture. Margaret slowly lowered the papers. Mr. Harper specifically instructed me that if anyone interrupted his final letter, I was to read their name aloud. Richard frowned. What? She looked directly at him. The first interruption. Richard Harper. Several relatives looked at him. His face turned red. Margaret calmly continued. If Richard interrupted before my letter was finished, it means he still hasn't learned patience. A nervous laugh escaped one of Richard's cousins. Richard slammed his hand on the table. This is insane. Margaret looked at another page. Second interruption. Richard Harper. He also predicted that. Silence. Richard slowly leaned back into his chair. For the first time, he stopped talking. Margaret continued, if you're wondering how I knew. Because I've watched Richard interrupt people his entire life. A few people looked away to hide their smiles. Ethan stared at the table, embarrassed for his father. Margaret turned another page. Now, let's talk about my family. To my daughter Lisa. Thank you for never asking me for anything I wasn't willing to give. Lisa quietly wiped away a tear. To my employees. You helped me build more than a company. You helped me build a life. Margaret reached the next paragraph. She took a slow breath. Richard noticed. What? What does it say? She looked directly at him. To my son, Richard. Before I tell you what you're receiving, I need everyone in this room to know something. Richard smiled again. Here it comes. Margaret kept reading. 8 months ago, while I was lying in a hospital bed, Richard didn't ask if I was afraid. He asked me to surrender everything I'd spent 53 years building. The room became perfectly still. Richard's smile disappeared. That's not true. Margaret didn't stop. When I refused, he left without saying goodbye. Richard stood up. He can't prove that. Margaret quietly reached beneath the table. She removed a small digital recorder. Richard froze. What is that? My client instructed me to play this. Immediately after reading that paragraph, she pressed a button. The room filled with a familiar voice. Richard's voice. Dad. You're not getting any younger. Just sign the papers. My voice answered calmly. I'm still capable of making my own decisions. Richard laughed on the recording. Maybe today. But not for much longer. The recording ended. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Lisa slowly turned toward her brother. You actually said that Richard looked around the room. You don't understand. I was trying to help. Margaret quietly replied. My client expected you would say exactly that. She turned another page. If Richard claims he was trying to help, ask him one simple question. Margaret looked up. Richard. My client left a question for you. He swallowed hard. What question? She read it slowly. If I had signed those papers, would you have ever given Harper Steele back to me? Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came out, not one word. The silence answered for him. Margaret nodded sadly. I'll mark that. As no response, Richard suddenly exploded. This whole thing is a setup. My father hated embarrassing people. Margaret slowly closed the folder. You're right. He didn't. He hated being betrayed. She reached for the second sealed envelope, the one that had remained untouched since the meeting began. Everyone watched her break the seal. Inside was a single handwritten letter and a small brass key taped to the back. Richard frowned. A key? Margaret smiled. Yes. According to your father's written instructions, this key belongs to only one person. She looked past everyone at the table, straight at 14-year-old Ethan, then quietly said, Young man, would you please stand? Ethan slowly stood. Every eye in the room turned toward him. He looked at the brass key, then at Margaret. I think you've made a mistake. Margaret smiled gently. I haven't. Your grandfather left very specific instructions. She unfolded another handwritten page. This is to be read only after Ethan stands. The room became completely silent. Richard folded his arms. What is this now? Margaret ignored him. She began reading. Ethan, if you're standing right now, it means you've become the man I hoped you would be. The boy's eyes immediately filled with tears. You probably don't understand why you're here. That's because you've never asked me for anything. And that's exactly why you're the first person I've chosen. Richard let out a sarcastic laugh. He's a kid. What exactly is he supposed to inherit? Margaret stopped reading. She looked directly at Richard. My client instructed me to remind you that every interruption costs you something. Richard frowned. What does that mean? She picked up another document. It means you've already violated the conditions attached to your inheritance. The room stirred. What conditions? Richard demanded. Margaret calmly continued reading. Richard, every time you interrupt this reading, you confirm another lesson I tried to teach you but failed. Because a man who cannot listen can never be trusted to lead. Lisa quietly lowered her head. She knew exactly what her father meant. Richard had interrupted people his entire life. Employees, family, even strangers. Margaret continued. Now, back to Ethan. She handed the brass key to the 14-year-old. He accepted it with shaking hands. What does it open? Margaret smiled. Your grandfather said you'd ask that. She reached beneath the conference table. This time, she placed a small wooden box in front of Ethan. It was old, dark walnut. The brass lock matched the key perfectly. Richard leaned forward. Seriously? A box? This is becoming a magic show. Margaret said nothing. Ethan carefully inserted the key. His hands trembled so badly, it took him 2 attempts. Finally, the lock clicked. Every person in the room leaned forward. Inside, there wasn't money. There weren't jewels. There weren't stock certificates. There was only a faded leather journal and an old factory identification badge. Ethan looked confused. Grandpa's work badge, Margaret nodded. Please open the journal. The first page contained only 1 sentence, written entirely by hand. If you're reading this, you've just become the guardian of our family's truth. Richard laughed again. A diary. That's what all this drama was about. Margaret quietly replied, Keep listening. Ethan slowly turned the page. Every page contained photographs, old newspaper clippings, factory blueprints, receipts, letters. Richard frowned. What is all that? Margaret answered. The complete history of Harper Steele. So? She looked him directly in the eyes. The history your father never wanted destroyed. Richard's confidence slowly faded. Margaret continued reading. Ethan. The company everyone calls Harper Steel was never built by one man. Hundreds of families sacrificed to build it. Never let anyone treat it like a prize to be divided. Ethan carefully turned another page. A photograph slipped onto the table. He picked it up. It showed me. Standing beside dozens of factory workers nearly 40 years earlier. Every employee had signed the back. Richard shrugged. I've seen those pictures before. No, Margaret corrected him. You've seen copies. She removed the original photograph from Ethan's hands, then flipped it over. The signatures covered every inch of the back. At the bottom, one sentence had been written in blue ink. Promise us this company will always belong to people who earn it. Richard suddenly stopped smiling. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another envelope hidden inside the journal. This one had never been opened. Across the front, my handwriting read, "Read this before anyone learns who owns Harper Steel." A heavy silence settled over the room. Richard looked at his attorney. His attorney looked away. Something wasn't right. Richard could feel it now. For the first time since entering the conference room, he wasn't thinking about what he was going to inherit. He was wondering whether there was anything left for him to inherit at all. Margaret carefully broke the final wax seal. She unfolded the document. Read the first line, then slowly looked up. Her eyes settled on Richard. I believe. This is the moment your father knew would silence the room. She took a slow breath, then read the sentence that caused every person at the table to freeze. Legally, Harper Steel has not belonged to the Harper family. For the past 12 years, nobody spoke. Not even Richard. He stared at Margaret as if she'd read the wrong document. What did you just say? She calmly repeated herself. Harper Steel has not legally belonged to the Harper family for the past 12 years. Richard laughed, a short, forced laugh. That's impossible. My father owned 100% of the company. Margaret slowly shook her head. He controlled it. That's very different. Richard slammed both hands onto the table. Then who owns it? Margaret didn't answer. Instead, she slid a thick stack of documents across the table. Read the first page. Richard snatched the papers. The title alone drained the color from his face. Harper Legacy Trust. His eyes moved faster, page after page, signature after signature. Then he stopped. What? This can't be real. Margaret looked at everyone in the room. 12 years ago, after Mrs. Eleanor Harper survived her battle with cancer, Mr. Daniel Harper quietly transferred every share of Harper Steel into an irrevocable trust. The room erupted with whispers. Lisa looked stunned. I never knew. You weren't supposed to. Margaret answered softly. Almost no one knew. Richard threw the papers onto the table. Why would he hide something like this? Margaret opened my journal. He answered that question himself. She began reading. Businesses don't disappear because markets fail. They disappear because the wrong people inherit them. Richard's jaw tightened. If my children ever believed Harper Steel existed to make them rich, then I had already failed as a father. Silence. Margaret continued. So I created something they could never sell. Richard interrupted. That's illegal. No. A deep voice answered from the doorway. Everyone turned. An elderly man wearing a navy blue suit slowly walked inside. Richard frowned. I know you. Margaret smiled. Yes, you do. This is Thomas Reynolds, the corporate attorney who helped your father create the Harper Legacy Trust. Richard's confidence disappeared. Thomas placed another folder on the table. I've represented your father for 38 years, and I personally filed every document. Richard looked around the room. No, there has to be a mistake. Thomas quietly pushed one page toward him. Read the signature. Richard lowered his eyes. There, at the bottom, was my signature. Beside it, my late wife Eleanor's. Everything had been notarized. Everything was legal. Everything had been planned. Richard slowly looked up. So? What happens now? Thomas folded his hands. The trust owns Harper Steel. It owns every building, every machine, every patent, every dollar. Richard swallowed hard. And who controls the trust? Thomas smiled. That answer is in your father's final letter. Margaret unfolded another page. For 12 years, I've watched everyone around me. Some people became kinder. Some became greedy. Only one person never changed. Everyone instinctively looked toward Ethan. The boy stared at the table, completely overwhelmed. Margaret kept reading Richard. I wanted you to become the man who earned this responsibility. Instead, You became the man who expected it. Richard whispered. Dad, Margaret continued, a company should never be inherited. It should be entrusted. Thomas removed one final legal binder. The trust has 5 voting trustees. Lisa looked confused. 5. Thomas nodded. Yes. Mr. Daniel Harper selected them himself. Richard quickly asked, Who are they? Thomas read the list. Margaret Collins. Myself. 2 senior employees who have worked at Harper Steel for over 30 years. Richard looked relieved. And the 5th, Thomas slowly smiled, the only trustee with permanent voting authority, is the person holding the brass key. Every eye turned toward Ethan. The 14-year-old nearly dropped it. What? Thomas nodded. Your grandfather appointed you 12 years ago. Ethan's voice trembled. I was 2 years old. Correct. So I couldn't have agreed. You didn't need to. Your grandfather believed one day. You'd understand why. Richard stood up so fast, his chair crashed onto the floor. This is insane. He's a child. He can't run a company. Thomas calmly replied. He doesn't. The board does. But no major decision, no sale, no merger, no liquidation can ever happen without his vote. The room fell silent again. Richard finally understood. He had spent years trying to inherit a company that legally couldn't be sold without the permission of the one person he had ignored his entire life, his own son. Then Ethan quietly opened the leather journal one last time. A folded envelope slipped onto the table. Across the front, written in my handwriting, were the words that made Margaret slowly close her eyes. Ethan, read this out loud, especially if your father is in the room. Ethan stared at the envelope. His hands shook. I don't think I can. Margaret smiled gently. Your grandfather believed you could. The room became completely silent. Richard crossed his arms. Go ahead. I'm sure Dad left another speech. Ethan slowly opened the envelope. Inside, there was only one handwritten page. He recognized my handwriting immediately. He took a deep breath, then began reading. If Ethan is reading this, it means my voice is gone. So today, his will become stronger than mine ever was. The boy swallowed hard. Ethan, never confuse wealth with worth. A rich man can still leave his family poor. Poor in honesty, poor in kindness, poor in character. The room was so quiet, the air conditioner sounded loud. Ethan continued. Your father wasn't born greedy. I spoiled him. Every time I rescued him from failure, I taught him that actions had no consequences. Richard slowly lowered his head. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He looked ashamed. If Richard is standing in this room, I still love you. Richard looked up. Tears filled his eyes. But love without accountability destroys families. Today, you're finally meeting consequences. Lisa quietly began crying. Even Margaret removed her glasses. Ethan continued reading. Harper Steel will never belong to one person again. It belongs to every family that depends on it. The workers, the apprentices, the veterans we hired when nobody else would. The single mothers who built careers inside our walls. Protect them, always. Thomas reached into his briefcase. I believe this is the appropriate moment. He removed a blue folder. The Harper Legacy Trust Annual Report. Richard frowned. What does that have to do with anything? Thomas opened the report. For the past 12 years, 10% of Harper Steel's yearly profits have funded scholarships, medical assistance for retired employees, and emergency support for workers' families. The room looked stunned. Lisa whispered, Dad never told us. Thomas smiled. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he believed success meant responsibility. Richard slowly sank back into his chair. He looked around the room. Every employee, every attorney, every family member. Not one person looked at him with admiration anymore, only disappointment. Then Ethan reached the final paragraph. His voice cracked. To my grandson, if everyone in this room is waiting for revenge, don't give it to them. Richard closed his eyes. Justice changes behavior. Revenge only changes victims. So here's my final request. Ethan stopped. His eyes widened. Margaret smiled. Keep reading. He nodded. Richard, your punishment isn't losing Harper Steel. Your punishment is earning back the respect you threw away. If your son ever believes you've changed, he may choose to trust you again. That decision belongs to him, not to lawyers, not to judges, and not even to me. The room fell completely silent. Ethan slowly lowered the letter. A single tear rolled down his face. Richard stood without saying a word. He walked toward his son, stopped only a few feet away. "I'm sorry." The words sounded unfamiliar, as though he'd never spoken them before. "I failed you, grandfather. I failed you." Ethan looked down at the brass key in his hand, then back at his father. "I can't forgive you today." Richard nodded. "I know. But I'd like the chance to become someone worth forgiving." Nobody spoke. Margaret quietly closed the will. Thomas gathered the legal documents. The meeting was over, but something much bigger had just begun. 6 months later, Richard was no longer sitting in the executive offices. He worked on the factory floor, the same place where I had started 53 years earlier. He arrived before sunrise, left after sunset, not because anyone ordered him to, because he wanted to earn back what money could never buy: respect. Every Friday after school, Ethan visited the factory, not as an owner, as a student. He learned every machine, every department, every employee's name, just as I once had. 5 years later, Harper Steel celebrated its 70th anniversary. Above the main entrance, a new bronze plaque had been installed. It didn't carry my name, or Richard's, or Ethan's. It simply read, "A legacy is never measured by what you leave behind, but by the character you leave within others." Visitors often asked why the company's founder wasn't honored with a giant statue. The employees always gave the same answer. He never wanted people looking at him. He wanted them looking after each other. And every time Ethan walked past that plaque, he quietly touched the brass key hanging beside it, not because it unlocked a company, because it reminded him that the strongest inheritance isn't wealth, it's the courage to protect what others would rather possess. If this story touched your heart, remember this: the greatest thing a parent can leave behind isn't money. It's a legacy that teaches the next generation how to choose character over greed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes that integrity is worth more than any inheritance.